They were flying through darkness above the Atlantic Ocean when it happened. It wasn't a storm that brought the plane down. It wasn't a bomb or a hijacker or an explosion. The truth is more terrifying than that. Because what killed them was a misunderstanding, a mistake made in silence, a reaction driven by fear, and a moment when pulling the wrong lever meant pulling the entire aircraft out of the sky. This is not just a story about a plane crash. This is about what happens when technology becomes too trusted, when human instinct loses its way, and when no one in the cockpit truly understands what the plane is trying to say. Welcome back to True Scary Air Disaster Stories. Today we are stepping into one of the most haunting and confusing crashes in modern aviation history. This is the story of Air France Flight 447, a state-of-the-art Airbus A330, a calm night flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, a route that had been flown safely for years, with 3 trained pilots, 225 passengers, and nothing unusual on the radar. But what happened next defied logic. The plane vanished in the middle of the ocean. It took search teams years to find out why, and when they did, what they uncovered wasn't a failure of metal or machine. It was a failure of human comprehension. It was a moment where the cockpit crew faced confusing data, mixed signals, and an unfamiliar situation. And instead of pausing, they acted. Instead of holding steady, they pulled. They pulled the nose up into the sky and kept pulling for over 3 minutes until the aircraft stalled and then dropped into black water with no warning, no mayday call, no chance to say goodbye. So before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever done what felt right only to learn it was completely wrong? Have you ever frozen in uncertainty, then made a move just to feel in control? Now, imagine doing that at 35,000 feet while hundreds of lives depend on you. That's the weight we're going to feel tonight. That's the story of Flight 447. Let's begin. Air France Flight 447 departed Rio de Janeiro at 7:29 p.m. local time on May 31, 2009, with clear skies over Brazil and a calm ocean stretching into the night. The aircraft was an Airbus A330, one of the most modern and reliable jets in commercial aviation. Its destination was Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, a flight expected to last just over 11 hours. On board were 216 passengers and 12 crew members, including 3 pilots. Captain Marc Dubois, 58 years old, had logged over 11,000 flight hours and was highly experienced. The 2 co-pilots, David Robert and Pierre-Cedric Bonin, were younger but fully certified to operate the flight. The flight plan included a period of rest for the captain, so the 2 co-pilots would be at the controls during the most critical phase of the flight, the nighttime crossing of the Intertropical Convergence Zone, an area known for heavy turbulence and fast-changing weather. The departure was smooth. Passengers settled in. Dinner was served. The cabin dimmed as the lights of Rio vanished behind the plane. As the A330 gained altitude, the onboard systems took over. Like most long-haul flights, the aircraft was flying on autopilot. Every control input, every adjustment to speed and heading was being handled by a computer system designed to reduce pilot workload. And for several hours, nothing went wrong. But as the aircraft crossed into the open Atlantic, the sky outside began to change. The Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ, is a belt of storms that circles the Earth near the equator. On satellite maps, it often appears as a long band of clouds and convective activity. For pilots, it represents a stretch of sky where thunderstorms can rise to 50,000 feet and visibility can vanish in seconds. By 1:45 a.m., UTC Flight 447 was approaching this zone. There was no storm directly in its path, but the radar showed buildups of moisture and uneven cloud mass ahead. Around this time, the captain left the cockpit to begin his scheduled rest, leaving the two co-pilots to monitor the crossing. The transition was normal. They briefed the weather, they discussed the plan, and they continued on course. The cabin crew moved through the aisles. Passengers slept under blankets. Some clutched neck pillows. Others scrolled through their entertainment screens, unaware of the sky turning black around them. The aircraft was flying at 35,000 feet, cruising smoothly at 520 knots. Everything appeared routine, but the radar did not tell the whole story. The storm cells were not aligned neatly. Some were masked by stronger echoes. The temperatures were low and the aircraft would soon be passing through altitudes where supercooled water droplets could accumulate. Ice at high altitude is one of the oldest threats in aviation. It can alter the airflow around the wings. It can block sensors. It can cause systems to react with incomplete or misleading data. But to the pilots, there was no immediate reason for concern. The aircraft was handling well. The autopilot was steady. They adjusted course slightly to avoid some growing returns in the radar screen, but nothing indicated danger. At 1:55 a.m. UTC, the aircraft was entering the thickest part of the convergence zone. The sky outside was black. Lightning flickered in the distance. Turbulence began to increase. The co-pilots engaged seatbelt signs and confirmed their altitude. They were now deep in one of the most unpredictable weather corridors in the world. But they trusted the systems. They trusted the aircraft. They trusted that any challenge ahead would be manageable because the Airbus A330 had flown through storms before and it had always made it through. What they didn't know was that ice was already forming on one of the plane's most critical external sensors, and that very soon the data on their screens would begin to lie to them, not because of a computer glitch or a system failure, but because nature had reached out and touched the machine in a way that no checklist could fully prepare them for. At 2:10 a.m. UTC, something subtle but significant happened. The pitot tubes on the outside of the Airbus responsible for measuring airspeed began to freeze. These small instruments exposed directly to the airstream are essential for flight computers to understand how fast the aircraft is moving. When they become blocked with ice, the airspeed data becomes unreliable. The aircraft detecting this inconsistency followed its programming and disengaged the autopilot. Suddenly, control of the plane was handed back to the human pilots. For a moment, nothing appeared wrong, but confusion began to set in almost immediately. The co-pilot in the left seat, Bonin, reacted first. Without consulting his colleague, he pulled back on the side stick, causing the nose of the aircraft to rise. He believed the plane was descending too fast based on the data in front of him, but that data was corrupted. And the Airbus, like many modern jets, did not include traditional mechanical feedback. The two side sticks were not linked. One pilot could pull while the other remained unaware. As Bonin raised the nose, the airspeed readings dropped further, and the aircraft entered what is known as a high-altitude stall. The air flowing over the wings could no longer generate lift. The plane was no longer flying, it was falling. But to the pilots, it felt like a climb. The vertical speed showed a gain, the pitch was up, but the truth was hidden by the false sense of control. The right seat co-pilot Robert noticed the change. He asked Bonin what he was doing. Bonin responded vaguely. He thought they were diving, so he was trying to climb. Neither pilot called out a clear diagnosis. No one mentioned the possibility of a stall. The Airbus A330 is designed to resist stalls under normal conditions, but with invalid sensor data, the protective systems were no longer active. The aircraft was now relying entirely on pilot input, but the pilots didn't know what they were dealing with. They kept trying to fly the plane as if it were still in normal operation. and with each passing second, the nose stayed too high, the engine stayed at idle, and the altitude bled away. They were in a stall, falling through the night at thousands of feet per minute, and no one in the cockpit said the word. The stall warning sounded briefly, then stopped. Because the sensors disagreed, the warning logic became erratic. Sometimes it sounded, sometimes it didn't. This inconsistency made the situation worse. The pilots began chasing symptoms instead of addressing the cause. They talked about speed attitude controls, but never about airflow or lift or stall. They pulled levers, changed thrust, adjusted pitch, but never pushed forward to break the stall. In that cockpit, inside one of the most advanced airplanes in the world, 2 trained pilots were flying blind. And just a few feet behind them, passengers slept unaware that the aircraft had entered a slow but steady fall from the sky. Captain Dubois, resting in the crew cabin, had not yet been called. The co-pilots believed they could manage the situation. They didn't yet realize they had lost control. The plane was still responding, still turning still, indicating changes in speed and altitude. But none of it matched reality. The ocean below was getting closer, and the truth inside the cockpit was getting more distorted. At 2:11 a.m., UTC Bonin pulled the stick back again. The plane's nose rose further. The angle of attack, the measure of how much the wing is tilted into the air, exceeded critical limits. Lift collapsed. The stall deepened. But the cockpit never filled with alarms or chaos. It filled with confusion. And in that confusion, the most dangerous action wasn't inaction. It was doing the wrong thing with total confidence. The aircraft was now fully stalled, fallen from the sky, and the men holding the controls didn't know it. They thought they were climbing. They thought the sky was fighting back. But it was gravity pulling on wings that no longer worked in silence and with no mercy. At 2:11 a.m., UTC, less than a minute after the autopilot disconnected, the captain was called back to the cockpit. The call was brief, casual, without panic. The co-pilots still believed they were handling an altitude or speed issue, not a full aerodynamic stall. But the situation had already spiraled far beyond routine. As Captain Dubois stepped into the cockpit, the plane was falling at a rate of over 10,000 feet per minute. The angle of attack remained dangerously high, but the aircraft felt stable to the touch, deceiving the senses of those at the controls. Dubois asked what was going on. Bonin and Robert gave conflicting answers. One said they had lost speed indications. The other mentioned turbulence. No one said the word stall. No one said they were falling. Dubois took his seat and quickly reviewed the instruments. The display showed the aircraft in a climb, but the altimeter was dropping rapidly. The vertical speed indicator showed descent. The airspeed indicator still flickered inconsistently. The stall warning had returned briefly, then stopped again. The cockpit was a swirl of data, none of it reliable. The men were now flying by instinct, not understanding. Bonin continued to hold the side stick back, keeping the nose high, trying to gain altitude. Robert suggested pushing the nose down, but did not override the input. The Airbus side stick design allowed for dual input without canceling each other. Unless one pilot took priority, both inputs would average out. So the aircraft remained nose up in a deepening stall. The engines were producing thrust, but the wings were not generating lift. They were no longer flying, they were falling in controlled chaos. Dubois asked for clarity. He was experienced calm, but he too was trying to piece together a puzzle with missing parts. The flight computers were not designed to display clear stall warnings in this configuration. With the angle of attack sensors showing values beyond normal flight, the system limited information instead of emphasizing it. The cockpit remained dimly lit, quiet, not the chaos one imagines in a disaster. But beneath the surface, the logic had broken down. The men kept trying different inputs, adjusting power level in wings, but none addressed the core issue. The aircraft needed to pitch down to regain airflow over the wings. It needed a simple correction. But surrounded by noise, uncertainty, and fatigue, that decision never came. At 2:12 a.m. UTC, the plane dropped below 30,000 feet. The stall continued. The wings fluttered but did not bite the air. Bonin asked what to do. Dubois tried to regain a sense of direction. The radio altimeter warned of decreasing altitude. Still, no one made the critical move. The moment that could have saved them was slipping away with every second. In the cabin, passengers still had no idea. Some were still asleep. Some may have felt the turbulence, the descent, but there were no screams, no warnings. The flight attendants had not been informed. The cabin remained pressurized, the lights still on. Outside, the ocean was invisible in the dark, a silent mirror waiting below. The black boxes later revealed that communication in the cockpit remained tense, clipped, and incomplete. Dubois asked repeatedly for explanations. Robert gave observations. Bonin offered guesses, but none of them diagnosed the problem, and so none of them solved it. At 2:13 a.m. UTC, the aircraft had lost nearly 15,000 feet of altitude. They were in freefall in the most advanced plane money could buy, guided by men who had lost the one thing that mattered most: understanding. As seconds slipped by, the Airbus continued to descend, its nose stubbornly pitched upward, its speed bleeding away, and the final chance to recover vanished into the clouds behind them. By 2:13 a.m., UTC Air France, Flight 447 had entered the final stage of its descent, still stalled, still nose high, still misunderstood by the three men inside the cockpit. The aircraft was falling at nearly 10,000 feet per minute. The engines were working, but the wings were not. Lift had been lost nearly 2 full minutes earlier, yet no one had taken the action required to recover it. Dubois, the captain, attempted to make sense of the data. He asked the co-pilots for explanations, but the replies were fragmented. Bonin continued to pull back on the side stick. Robert occasionally suggested nose-down input, but neither took control decisively. The Airbus was in a deadlock both in the air and in command. At this point, the ocean was less than 20,000 feet below. Still, none of the crew had fully recognized the reality of the situation. They were falling, not flying, and the aircraft was unresponsive not because it was broken, but because it was being flown outside of the laws of aerodynamics. The stall warning returned intermittently, but its inconsistency only added to the confusion. Some stall warnings were cut off due to contradictory inputs. Others were misinterpreted as sensor faults. At one point, Bonin even stated that they had control, that everything was fine. But everything was not fine. The nose remained high. The angle of attack hovered around 40 degrees, a number far beyond any recoverable flight configuration. The aircraft was descending nearly vertically, wings level, but useless. At 2:14 a.m. UTC, the altitude passed below 10,000 feet. In a typical descent, this would be the point where pilots reduce speed and prepare for approach. On Flight 447, it marked the beginning of the final plunge. There were no emergency announcements, no time to brief the cabin. The passengers remained in their seats, unaware that their aircraft had already become a falling object, not a controlled vehicle. The sky was still dark. The weather outside remained turbulent, masking any external references. The pilots could not see the horizon. They could not see the sea. The flight displays still showed attitude, pitch vertical speed, but none of it brought clarity. Dubois instructed a go-around. Bonin responded by increasing thrust, but kept the nose up. The engines roared. The speed began to rise slightly, but the stall remained. No recovery was initiated. The aircraft needed only one thing: nose-down input and a pause to let airflow reattach to the wings. But that action never came. At 2:14 and 27 seconds, the final stall warning sounded. The descent rate reached 11,000 feet per minute. At 2:14 and 28 seconds, the ground proximity warning activated. The system announced, pull up, but the plane was already pointed skyward. There was no room to climb. At 2:14 and 30 seconds, the aircraft impacted the Atlantic Ocean at full stall, nose-high wings, level engines producing power but unable to generate lift. The tail struck, first followed by the fuselage, breaking the aircraft into thousands of pieces. The impact killed all 228 people instantly. There were no survivors. The wreckage sank quickly, scattering across the ocean floor at depths of nearly 4,000 meters. No emergency beacon had time to activate. No final message was sent. The aircraft simply vanished from radar. For days, no one knew where it had gone. The last transmission from the cockpit had been over the Atlantic, routine and calm. The search began with nothing but a last known position and a trail of silence. For families waiting in Paris, the news was unbearable. Hours passed, then days, and still no sign. Eventually, floating debris was spotted: life vests, seat cushions, small fragments of fuselage. But the black boxes would not be found for almost 2 years. And when they were recovered, they told a story that no one wanted to believe. Not a mechanical failure, not a sudden explosion, but a slow, steady fall, misunderstood from the first second to the last. In the days following the disappearance of Air France, Flight 447 search teams from France and Brazil began scouring the Atlantic for clues. Ships and aircraft were dispatched across a vast expanse of ocean, guided only by the last known coordinates and small floating debris. The initial recovery efforts were slow and heartbreaking. Pieces of the aircraft were found scattered across the water, but no clear sign of what had gone wrong emerged. The flight recorders, the cockpit voice recorder, and the flight data recorder remained lost somewhere in the depths. Families received confirmation of the crash days later, but they received no answers. How could a modern aircraft simply vanish without warning in calm skies over open water? The aviation world was stunned. Theories swirled. Some believed lightning had struck the aircraft. Others suspected explosive decompression. But the truth would not come for another 2 years. In May 2011, a deep-sea submersible finally located the wreckage of Flight 447 on the ocean floor nearly 4 kilometers beneath the surface. Black boxes were recovered intact, preserved in the cold and pressure of the abyss. What they revealed shocked investigators and the world. There had been no mechanical failure. The engines had functioned normally. The airframe had remained intact until impact. The crash had been caused by a loss of situational awareness, triggered by a brief failure of airspeed indicators due to ice. The autopilot had disengaged as designed. The pilots had taken control, but they had misunderstood the situation. They had not recognized the stall. They had not taken proper recovery steps. And most tragically, they had continued pulling back on the controls, deepening the stall for over 3 minutes. The report was clear. The accident was preventable. The actions of the crew under stress and confusion had led to the fatal descent. In response, aviation authorities around the world issued new guidance on stall recognition and recovery. Airlines updated training programs. Simulator scenarios were revised. Emphasis was placed on manual flying skills, angle of attack awareness, and communication in the cockpit. The Airbus design itself came under scrutiny, particularly the unlinked side sticks and limited stall warning logic under certain failure conditions. But beyond the technical changes, something deeper shifted. Pilots were reminded that no system is perfect. that trust in automation must be balanced with understanding, that the human brain under pressure can make the wrong move for the right reason. The families of the victims, meanwhile, were left with questions no report could fully answer. Who spoke last? Who knew what was happening? Did anyone in the cabin realize? Were there moments of awareness before impact? These questions lingered in the silence that followed. Memorials were built, names engraved, but grief does not end with a report. It becomes part of the sky, part of the checklist, part of the lesson. And that lesson is not just about flying. It is about the danger of false confidence, about the cost of silence in moments that demand clarity, about the need to pause, to ask to say the word stall out loud when the sky no longer lifts you. In the years since the crash, Flight 447 has become a case study in human factors. In training sessions around the world, pilots listen to the cockpit audio, watch the data scroll across screens, and ask the question that no one can answer. Why didn't they push the nose down? Why didn't they realize? And the truth is, sometimes people don't know they are falling until they hit the ground. That is the legacy of Flight 447. A flight that should have arrived in Paris with quiet passengers and a sleepy crew. A flight that became a symbol of modern aviation's blind spot, and a reminder that no matter how advanced our machines become, the human behind the controls must never stop asking questions. There are some stories that stay with you not because of how loud they are, but because of how quiet the ending was. Air France. Flight 447 did not explode in the sky. It did not go down in a blaze of fire or chaos. It fell in silence with everyone still strapped to their seats, unaware of what was happening in the cockpit just a few feet away. It was a crash that left no survivors, but left behind echoes that changed the way we fly. Sometimes in life, we find ourselves in situations where nothing feels certain. The signals we trust start to flicker. The tools we rely on begin to fail. And the people around us are just as unsure as we are. In those moments, it's easy to panic. It's easy to react instead of understand. But this story reminds us that doing something just to feel in control can be more dangerous than doing nothing at all. That silence can be fatal, and that the most important words are the ones spoken in time. Stall, pull up, let go, try again. So if you've ever found yourself holding on too tightly, trying to force something that isn't working, ask yourself if you're climbing when you should be falling back to rise again. Because the sky does not forgive misunderstanding. And the ones who fall are not always those who lack knowledge, but those who are too afraid to pause and listen. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story moved you, if it made you think, then carry its lesson with you. Share it, learn from it, and most of all, remember that even in the darkest skies, understanding is what keeps us in the air.